When she first launched in the late 1930s, the RMS Queen Elizabeth was the pride of the Cunard fleet, one of the most lavish, largest, and fastest liners afloat. But following her sail in the 1960s, she would ultimately meet a tragic fate off the coast of Hong Kong, only to be left abandoned for years as a charred wreck. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 97th episode of Abandoned, we're going to take a look at this iconic ship's life and sudden death to find out what happened. Back in the early 1930s, Cunard had merged with the White Star Line to become Cunard White Star, and following their launch of the RMS Queen Mary, at the time the world's largest passenger ship, the new flagship of Great Britain, the government would go on to grant Cunard White Star the funds for a running mate to accompany the Queen Mary. This new ship, intended to be larger and more technologically advanced, would be pushed forward, becoming hull number 552, also known as the RMS Queen Elizabeth. The vessel was not only slated to be larger than the Queen Mary, making her the new largest ship in the world, but it was also promised to be more efficient, cutting down the number of total boilers by half, resulting in the need for only 2 funnels instead of 3. This would result in more passenger deck space, as well as more cabins. So, after a little over 3 years of construction at the John Brown and Company builder yards in Scotland, in 1938 she would be launched and planned to enter service as a luxury transatlantic passenger liner by 1940. However, those dates may sound problematic, as during the Elizabeth's fitting out process, World War II would break out in Europe. Out of fear that the Germans might specifically target the ship, Cunard was ordered to move the ship away from the British Isles. So, unfinished and in an all-grey livery, the RMS Queen Elizabeth made a secret maiden voyage to New York City. It was there when the order came out that the British government would be requisitioning the vessel for war service. After being fitted out as a troop carrier in Singapore, RMS Queen Elizabeth would then enter war service as a reliable troop ship, carrying thousands of troops on single voyages across the Atlantic. In total, Queen Elizabeth would carry over 750,000 troops, sailing over 500,000 miles, all before sailing with a single paying passenger. By the end of the war, RMS Queen Elizabeth and her fleet mates were credited as crucial to the war effort, specifically praised by Winston Churchill. The liner soon went back into construction, now fitting the ship out as she had originally been intended. With the Cunard livery back on, the company would take possession of the grand ship, 8 years after the liner first completed construction. Having survived the war, the RMS Queen Elizabeth took her official maiden voyage with paying passengers on October 16, 1946, and she took to the seas as a strikingly beautiful and luxurious liner, one which was already well known and loved by both sides of the Atlantic. The new largest passenger ship in the world was a long and sleek ship, a more refined version of the RMS Queen Mary, as some called her. She was adorned with the classic Cunard white and black hull and superstructure, with those iconic red funnels. Within, the vessel had ample passenger comforts, with beautifully appointed public rooms, many of them finely crafted from over 50 types of rare woods. These 35 public areas would be lined with original paintings, leather, tapestries, brass, and velvet. Everywhere from the first-class observation lounge and writing room to the veranda grill and main lounge. It was all some of the most luxurious spaces at sea. The Elizabeth also had a decently large cinema, as well as an indoor swimming pool. The cabins carried on with the luxury too, as many of the staterooms would later feature ship-to-shore telephones and were also designed in a beautiful Art Deco fashion. Through the next few decades, Cunard and the Queen Elizabeth would in part dominate the transatlantic service, her and the Queen Mary becoming iconic ships, especially for their home country of England. The Elizabeth would see some updating in the mid-1950s, with the addition of underwater stabilizers to better stabilize the ship in adverse weather conditions. By this point, passenger airlines began flying non-stop from North America to Europe now that the Boeing 707 aircraft was in production. This extremely efficient alternative to the multi-day liner crossings suddenly had changed the way people moved across oceans, and the Cunard Queens were now in a tricky position. As passenger numbers continued to decline through the early 1960s, Cunard began sending the Queen Elizabeth on more leisure cruises to warmer climates. Despite the aging 1930s era ship feeling slightly outdated for the leisure market, Cunard would try and update it, providing central air conditioning throughout, as well as the addition of an aft swimming pool outside. Her operators figured that these new enhancements could keep the grand ship in service through at least the 1970s. However, that classic design for crossing the Atlantic didn't really translate well to the cruising market. Not only was Queen Elizabeth too wide to sail through the Panama Canal, severely limiting her prospects in the Pacific market, but she was also too deep of a draft to enter island ports in the Caribbean. With her high operating costs both in labor and in fuel, it seemed that the ship's prospects were going to be very limited. RMS Queen Mary was already pulled from service and sold to the city of Long Beach to become a museum ship in 1967. Cunard knew that the Queen Elizabeth would also have to be taken out of service and replaced by a more modern ship, as they had still wanted to run the classic Atlantic service, just with reduced inventory and with a more efficient liner. They had already been working on what was known as Project Q4, poised to be the successor of the RMS Queen Elizabeth, with a project that had been in development since the late 1950s. This concept liner would share a lot of design language, just an overall sleeker and more modern interpretation of the traditional style. This plan, however, would undergo various design alterations, ultimately settling on a very refined and smaller version, one which was set to be more versatile and set to enter service in 1969. This was the official replacement for the aging liner, this next-generation ship appropriately named the Queen Elizabeth II. By the time the QE2 began her sea trials, Cunard had planned to remove the original Queen Elizabeth from service. She made her final transatlantic crossing under the Cunard flag in November of 1968. But her retirement wasn't without a plan. That year, Cunard would sell a 15% stake in the operational rights to a new corporation run by a group of businessmen out of Philadelphia in America. Presumably spurred on by the great praise that came with permanently docking the Queen Mary, the purchasers intended to turn her into a museum and hotel ship in Florida as a part of a $100 million mixed-use development. So the Queen Elizabeth, now renamed simply the Elizabeth, made way for Port Everglades in South Florida. With very few modifications, by February of 1969, the ship would open to the public, charging visitors $2.50 to board the former luxury liner and tour the many public spaces and behind-the-scenes facilities. But there were quite a bit of issues with this. Cunard, which still owned the majority shares of the ship, publicly claimed how they were dissatisfied with the local governments and how they had been treating them and their queen. They would ultimately decide to end their ownership stake a few months later, as the ship would once again be sold by July of that year. To make things worse, by November of that year, and despite a planned large Thanksgiving Day gala, the local fire chief shuttered the vessel from the public, citing various fire safety concerns. While the ship would eventually clear inspections and reopen, the controversy wouldn't go away, as local newspapers were filled with stories of political deadlocks, potential mob ties, and constant operational issues with the ship. Clearly, the Elizabeth's time in Florida wasn't the surefire success it should have been. Throughout this whole time, the ship's owners were losing money. The strict fire code regulations, the harsh Florida weather, and subsequent maintenance, as well as the lower than expected number of visitors, all dragged down any hopes of the ship turning a profit. Soon, the owners slid into debt, going by a pay-as-you-go structure with the Port Authority. Despite the dock area that the ship was in having to be dredged out specifically for her placement there, the owners also were now forced to find a new permanent dock. Those owners would ultimately file for bankruptcy though, just as emergency repairs were needed following a boiler room fire that once again shuttered the vessel. From there, it would then go to auction, where there were very legitimate concerns that the likely near future for the liner was going to involve the scrapyard. That was until September of 1970. When a Chinese businessman, owner of a large shipping company out of Hong Kong, had purchased the former Queen Elizabeth for around $3.2 million. C.Y. Tung believed in education and wanted to develop his passion for shipboard learning in hopes to train future mariners. It was certainly a novel and slightly unconventional idea, but his plan was to bring the liner over to Hong Kong under the new name SSCY's University. From there, he planned to refurbish it and then send it on planned voyages out of San Francisco, Vancouver, and Hawaii, heading all across the Pacific into Asia and Australia. He planned to keep many of the public spaces as they were, a sort of working museum where teaching could be done within the historic spaces. This is while many of the former third-class cabins would be transformed into student residences. The former first-class cabins would stay the same, and he would actually sell them to the general public. So, under the command and advisement of the vessel's former commodore and some officers, the decision was made not to tow the ship to Hong Kong, but to sail it under her own power. On February 10th, 1971, the SS Seawise University set out of Fort Lauderdale, albeit very slowly. For years, the ship had various engine and boiler issues, so the ship was underway with only half of her boilers lit. That's only 6 of them, utilizing just 2 engines. This not only significantly decreased her speed, but the many technical issues with the boilers caused various contained fires, and at one point even left the former queen without power and adrift in the Caribbean Sea. Making a maximum of 11 knots, the ship slowly made its way to Southeast Asia. The planned several-week journey turned into 5 months, ultimately making it into Hong Kong Harbor by July. While this very long trip was underway, the Orient Overseas Lines, her new owners, began advertising the largest suites on board, which again were intended for the general public. They advertised it as a very long 75-day cruise, sailing all across the Pacific and starting in April of the next year. Despite newspapers in Singapore calling the ship tarnished and rusty, C.Y. Tung had his prize ship in port, and suddenly a flurry of activity embarked on the vessel. Through the rest of 1971, Seawise University would get the much-needed maintenance she needed, from a complete reconditioning of the engines to a new fire suppression system that was brought up to United States Maritime Code. The ship's former rusting Cunard livery had been sanded away, now repainted with an all-white livery featuring orange funnels with the line's logo printed in red on the side. By the end of the year, the multi-million-dollar renovation was nearing completion, but it turns out it would never actually finish. At around lunchtime on Sunday, January 9th, 1972, it's estimated that 3 fires started simultaneously aboard the liner while everyone was on their lunch break. With the various open shell doors drafting air through the ship, those small fires quickly grew out of control, particularly in the aft. Clearly there was something wrong, and as workers aboard began to evacuate, fire tugs were then scrambled to get out to the liner, but it would take them nearly an hour to reach the ship. By that point, the fires within were completely out of control and spreading quickly as enormous plumes of grayish-black smoke billowed out of the upper decks. As fireboats worked to spray the ship, it was clear that the efforts were not enough to stop the raging fires within. After around 4 hours of spraying the Seawise, the effort was called off and officials had decided to let the ship burn itself out. By this point, the liner had developed around a 17-degree list to her starboard side, a result of all the water that it had took on from the firefighting boats. The fire within burned hot, peeling the paint off the hull and breaking the thick porthole glass, opening them up with smoke pouring out. By nightfall, the fire continued to rage out of control, the darkness revealing just how out of control the fire really was. Overnight, it had burned so hot that by the morning, both the forward and aft sections of the superstructure had collapsed in on itself. The hull was also damaged by the fire, bending the very frame, and as the ship continued to smolder, fireboats returned to the scene to try and extinguish what was left. The former queen would by this point take on more water, her hull now severely weakened and likely no longer watertight. The vessel would then begin to sink and rest on the seabed, ultimately beginning to capsize and rest on her starboard side at a severe list. The whole ordeal went on for around 3 days, and by this point, the fires within the now completely burned out ship were finally extinguished. But the result was nothing more than devastating. SS Seawise University was obviously deemed a complete loss. The resulting wreck was an incredible sight. At the time, the world's largest passenger vessel ever built, reduced to nothing more than a smoldering shell, almost indistinguishable from the lavish liner it was just 70 hours prior. As for the cause of the fire, well, a few months later in July, a court of inquiry concluded that the most likely explanation was that the fires were deliberately set by, quote, persons unknown. So the fire, while not taking any lives, was an act of arson that not only brought down the world's largest passenger ship, but in which the culprits would never be caught. Instead, the 83,000-ton ship was left as it was in the Hong Kong harbor, left essentially completely abandoned. The wreck would continue to sit there for another few years, gently sticking out of the calm bay, her funnels still in their place, while the rest of the mangled steel had collapsed in. Both the bow and stern remained mostly intact though, the very tip of her prow mostly unaffected, even still having some of the white paint on it. Towards the aft, her outdoor pool remained in place, now half submerged. Just like the interiors, the whole ship was a blackened and rusty mess. Obviously a navigational and environmental hazard. By early 1973, salvage crews were already on site to investigate the wreck, various firms bidding to win the contract to remove it. Ultimately, at a cost of around $30 million, crews would begin the arduous and tedious work of removing most of the superstructure. Piece by piece, they would pull away sections of the wreck and scrap them. The process was long and very dangerous, the whole effort taking more than 2 years to complete, ending in 1976. After around 4 years since the fire began, the ship was, for the most part at least, completely gone. In total, around 45,000 tons of the ship were removed from the bay. This is while the rest of the liner, most of which being the lower part of the hull, sunk into the mud, was just left as it was. Once again, completely abandoned. It would stay this way with a wreck designation for the next few decades. That was until the 1990s, when the area was slated for land reclamation, specifically for the construction of the Kuaiting Container Terminal No. 9. During that construction, that area of the bay would be filled in, meaning the underwater wreck was now covered with earth. Apart from a few surviving artifacts, that was basically it of the former Queen Elizabeth. A few reminders of the past would pop up here and there. Every once in a while you see artifacts go up for auction, while some salvage items remain in scattered pieces across Hong Kong. Perhaps the most notable remaining artifacts are the original Q and E metal letters of the original nameplate at the bow. Following the fire, they were brought to California, where they remain today. The wreck was also somewhat prominently featured in the 1974 James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun, the wreck actually being the fictional MI6 headquarters. The vessel's largest passenger ship distinction, while lost after the fire, symbolically remained in place for over 50 years. That was until Royal Caribbean's Sovereign of the Seas set sail in 1987, arguably quite the decline in ship aesthetics during that time. Meanwhile, Cunard would go on to be acquired by the American cruise company Carnival, and the Queen Elizabeth II would go on to cross the Atlantic until 2008, where she'd become a floating hotel in Dubai around 10 years after that. Cunard, now a Carnival brand, would also bring back the Queen Elizabeth name. In 2011, they would launch the MS Queen Elizabeth, a modern cruise ship sharing little with the previous two liners, and with a design that was recycled from Carnival's other brand, Holland America. It's a rather unremarkable ship compared to the legacy that name holds. But that legacy is pretty incredible. The liner started out as an even more impressive way to cross the Atlantic than the Queen Mary. She served a full and highly regarded war career and continued to swiftly and comfortably transport passengers across the ocean, and did so successfully for 22 years. Her size and prominence was a great pride for her owners and all who sailed aboard her. So many were sad when she was laid up in Florida, only to fail under her new operators. But life was given back to the ship in Hong Kong, a return back to the seas with an innovative new purpose. But of course, it was never to be. It's hard to say what would have happened to the ship if she had completed her renovations and sailed under the Oriental Overseas Lines. Despite receiving refurbishment across the vessel, including her engines, the fact was that the boilers were still from the 1930s, and subsequently very inefficient. No matter what, the bones and power plant of the ship would have always limited her commercial viability. And while it remains to be seen, I tend to doubt that there would have been any effort to convert her to a hotel after the university project, especially after the, let's say, tumultuous Queen Mary Hotel. The reality was that basically every ocean liner built from that period of time had already been scrapped by the 1960s. QE1 was an outlier in that sense and was living on borrowed time. Perhaps then her fate, while violent and sad, would have resulted the same a few short years in the future. Now all that's left today is a few scattered artifacts around the world, and presumably a decaying lower hull buried within the sand, deep below a cargo port. Thanks for watching this video. If you like what I do, please do consider subscribing to the channel and checking out what else I have. If you're interested in more Cunard related content, I recently sailed aboard the Queen Mary 2, the world's only operating ocean liner, and the ship that also replaced the QE2. That video can be found on my second channel, Bright Sun Travels. A link will be in the description below. My name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.